a world of surveillance, corruption, and endless war, it's rare to get insight from the inside. No, I'm not just talking about the government. I'm referring to the clandestine world of intelligence agencies and the role they play in global affairs. That's where my next guest comes in. Her name is Amie Machon, and she resigned from the MI5, the UK's security service, back in 1996 after blowing the whistle on incompetence and corruption happening within the government. Given her experience as a secret agent, I first asked her what she saw that made her want to leave the agency. Take a look.
Well, a whole range of things, really. And this was way back in the 1990s, before the intelligence agencies took their gloves off after 9/11. And yet still, we saw so many crimes being committed. I mean, they ranged from things like files on government ministers in the UK, secret files, bombs that could and should have been prevented, mistakes were made, and then they were covered up by the spies, innocent people going to prison, illegal phone taps, and the culmination, really, the case that made us quit and go public and blow the whistle, was where MI6, which is a sort of James Bond branch of British intelligence, ended up funding affiliates of an al-Qaeda cell in Libya to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in 1996. Now, this was illegal under UK law. It went wrong. Obviously, Gaddafi survived to be murdered by them, 15 years later. And it also killed innocent people. So we couldn't think of anything more heinous. And this is why I and my former partner, David Shaler, who was also a colleague, resigned to blow the whistle about the crimes of the spies. Now, of course, once you do that under the UK law, you become the criminal because you break something called the Official Secrets Act, which says that you are never allowed to say anything about your work ever. There's no one you can take allegations or disclosures to legally.
And when you say preventing, or the bombings could have been prevented where innocent people died, I mean, when we're talking about that, is it an instance like a 9/11 type instance where intelligence officers are saying there was an enormous amount of information, almost too much, where they couldn't prevent it because they didn't know what threats were what? Or are you saying specifically pre-knowledge and deliberately ignoring something that killed people?
Well, there was a certain degree of pre-knowledge, shall we say, but mistakes were made. And one of the cases I'm thinking about was the 1993 bombing in the City of London. The attack was against a place called Bishopsgate, and this caused about £350 million worth of damage, and people died. And yet the bomber could and should have been arrested 6 months prior to the attack, and there was a mistake made by the investigating people who were following him around. They let him go free. And then they sort of covered it up when the inquiry came through as well. So the government never really got to the bottom of the story.
It seems like that happens
and this is
a lot.
Something we see time. Yeah, and we see this time and time again. Often it's not necessarily a major conspiracy in the run-up to an attack, but if they make a mistake, there is always a conspiracy to cover up that attack.
Right, exactly, yeah, the cover-up. It seems like all these intelligence agencies have connections to the people who are involved in these terrorist activities, but somehow it was missed, the warnings were missed, etc. But of course, the cover-up remains. What other backlash did you receive once you left and started speaking out? I mean, I know David was charged with the Official Secrets Act. Were you? I know that you guys were in exile for a while outside of the country.
Yes, it became very like a sort of spy novel. Once we blew the whistle, we went literally on the run around Europe, and we had to live in hiding for a year and then live in exile for 3 years. And David went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when the British tried to extradite him from France and failed in 1998, and then when he returned voluntarily to stand trial in 2000. I was arrested, but I was never charged with any crime. And many of our friends and our family and journalists as well involved in the case were also arrested, and some of them were charged and convicted for reporting the stories about the crimes of the spies. And it was just journalism, they were covering stories which were very much in public interest. So the ripples widened around this initial case, and it really sort of exposed the influence that the intelligence community can have to pressure the government to clamp down on whistleblowers, but also to pressure the media to cover up the stories and not cover them accurately.
And after you left to blow the whistle with your former partner, who you've mentioned numerous times, David, he went completely rogue, yet for a period you were still associating with him. So how do you respond to people who did claim, or who are claiming, that you deliberately are sabotaging the movement that you once helped build and are perhaps still working for the intelligence agency to do so?
Well, you always get people saying, you know, you never leave. I think you can leave, and you do it very abruptly, and that's when you blow the whistle and you go on the run and you face prosecution. No, it was very sad what happened to David. There's no doubt about that. And we see this time and time again with whistleblowers, that it's the old phrase, they use a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. And we're seeing this particularly in recent years in the US, where President Obama has used the Espionage Act, as you mentioned, to prosecute and incarcerate whistleblowers who are acting in the very best public interest, in a way that no other, all in aggregate, all the previous presidents haven't done. So the concept of trying to suppress a freedom and accountability and transparency, and you need all of those in order to have justice, is frightening to see. It's frightening to see the sheer scale of the pushback in the US at the moment. They seem to have been learning all the worst bits from the UK in terms of cracking down on whistleblowers.
You definitely are seeing a war on whistleblowers right now, Annie. And as a former spy, you just spoke about this botched attempt to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi in the 90s. I mean, how much of a role do these intelligence agencies like the CIA, MI5, and the Mossad play in the global war on terror strategy?
Well, a huge role, of course. And there is no doubt they get involved in dirty tricks and things. But it was particularly stark, I think, a couple of years ago when there was this so-called rebellion against Colonel Gaddafi, an invasion by the NATO forces. And we saw MI6 and the CIA on the ground in Libya training and arming and helping and supporting the very people that they had funded to try and assassinate Gaddafi in 1996. 15 years on, they're doing it openly. They're doing it in the full glare of the media. What used to be secret was now done flagrantly. And yet nobody seemed to have an issue with that, even when Gaddafi was pulled out of a tunnel and tortured and murdered. And I think that says a lot about our moral journey in the West since 9/11, where people have become quite sort of brutalized in the way that they view the violence going on in the Middle East. And it's not just Libya, of course. I mean, it's across the whole of North Africa and across the whole of the Middle East, where we now have drone strikes wiping out whole villages or wedding parties, and where we have kill lists drawn up by the CIA and ratified by your president every week. You know, I can't think of anything more heinous, really, as a war crime, and that's what's going on at the moment.
It is amazing that that is sort of brought into the light, and people seem to accept it. What would be considered completely unacceptable even during Bush. But specifically, let's talk about what kind of clandestine activity you think is going on when we're looking at Syria and Iran, which are two countries that, of course, we're hearing the war drums being beaten about constantly.
Well, Syria isn't a complete mess, of course, but what I find particularly hypocritical is in the UK, our government is now trying to find ways around the embargo on sending arms to the rebels. And yet these rebels are self-confessed affiliates of al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's a group called al-Nusra, particularly in the northeast of Syria, which now controls the area which is oil-rich, should we say. And they are so-called terrorist enemies, if you're going to look at al-Qaeda as our terrorist enemies, and yet our governments want to support them. So on the one hand, you have our governments fighting the war on terror in certain countries, on the other hand, funding those designated enemies in certain countries. So it's incredibly hypocritical.
Yeah, and we're already hearing the corporate media drum up all this nonsense about these Boston bombers suspects being linked to al-Qaeda within Iran. I mean, Annie, it really is absurd. It's really actually strangely and disturbingly reminiscent of the buildup of the Iraq War. When I turn on the TV one day and all of a sudden the news is talking about Saddam linked to 9/11, it's like the Twilight Zone. And, you know, in the wake of the tragedies like the Boston bombings, it seems like people are so quick to give up their freedoms in the name of security. But once these freedoms are hastily taken, how hard is it to get them back?
It's a damn hard fight, is all I can say. I mean, all these freedoms that we have won across the West have taken hundreds of years. The blood, the sweat, the sacrifice, and the tears of our ancestors. And for us casually to throw them away because we feel it will give us greater security is, one, wrong, and two, when we give them away, it's going to be so difficult to get them back. And it's the hysterical overreaction in the wake of something like a Boston attack. Yes, it's horrible, and my heart bleeds for the victims. But this is going on across the Middle East every day with drone strikes and suicide bombings and what have you. You know, every day there are hundreds of other people, other families, suffering just as much pain. So I think we need to remember why we have certain freedoms in place in the first place. And of course, most of these basic human rights were enshrined in the wake of World War II, because people remembered very vividly how easy it is to slide into a totalitarian state or fascist state. And also just to bear in mind that there are many, many other people suffering the same sort of pain across the world, and much of it is inflicted by the US military. So I think it's a dangerous path to go down for the US to give away their freedoms and then go and inflict the same sort of horror around the world.
It is about having a global perspective and really taking in what you just said, that these tragedies incurred around the world are mostly at the hands of these intelligence agencies. Amie Machon, thank you so much for coming on. Former MI5, you're an MI5 whistleblower, former MI5 agent, writer, European director of LEAP. Thank you so much.
Thank you.